Hello, my name's Stephen Cox, and I'm absolutely delighted to be with you all today. And what we're going to be looking at today is independent learning and how it really is the superpower of all the learning that you can possibly have. So what we're going to do in this session is to explore it in detail. What do we actually mean by independent learning? Where does it happen? What blocks it? Why doesn't it happen all the time in schools? And then we're going to move on to looking, well, how do we make this happen then? And we'll be exploring some of the practical easy steps, if you like, the baby step introductions. And then we're going to move on to look in more detail at some of the methodologies that support and promote and develop independent learning. And then we'll move on to look at a method that I worked with someone very famous in this area, and we got some incredible results out of. So that's where we're going. And then we'll do a little wrap up on, well, what can you do? Where should you focus your next steps? So I'm going to try and keep it as practical as possible. But I think it's really important that we engage in quite a high level of specificity here, because independent learning can get a bad name otherwise. And I know in some countries, certainly it's not seen as the panacea very much now, as we've moved much more to the direct instruction and curriculum heavy models. But, this is where we can explore it and see what's possible and what we can do. So why, you may be asking, am I qualified to do it? Well, I'm CEO of Osiris Educational, so we've spent 25 years now working with schools, with teachers, and we've trained over 500,000 teachers in that time and worked with over 11,000 schools from more than 50 countries now. So alongside that, I'm also the founder of the World Education Summit, so I've got to work with most of the leading professors around the world now on what they're doing. We've had to research a great deal of time and effort goes into what impact are we making with teacher development and what programs actually work and how do they stick. So on top of that, I've worked with Professor John Hattie for the last 10 years, which has been quite grueling because John's very particular about what's happening in education and how it works. But that's been really exciting because it really does start to unlock, well, what do we mean by the learning, never mind the independent element of that. So we're a lot more precise on that now and how it can work. And as well as that, I worked for about 8 years on independent learning projects and how do you actually bring them into school and how do you change the culture and fit them in, so it gets quite exciting. So that's kind of where I'm coming from. I'll leave my details up at the end if you want to find out more information or get in contact with me or discuss things, and off we go. So I'm going to use a presentation here just to help and guide you through, and that should sort of give you some pointers anyway as to where you can go. Okay, so what we're going to look at first then is really this whole kind of what do we mean by this superpower of independent learning? I think one of the most useful ways of looking at this and going straight into it is what happens when we get this. And for me, this is the blank canvas. This is what happens in real life. So we get these great ideas of what we can do. We spend a lot of time working linearly through it, through examinations, through testing, through to university. And then suddenly, boom, we're met with the real world. And what does the real world mean? And I'm not saying that school isn't the real world. What I'm saying is that the stuff that's going to happen that we're not going to be able to control the outcomes of, death, divorce, finding partners, finding new jobs, being made redundant. These are all absolutely extreme situations which happen in everyday life. And it's how we deal with and how we learn to cope with these become really crucial. But I think you can take this one right into the academic sphere as well, because what happens is as the education system gets more sophisticated in its assessment methods, and we'll be exploring that a little bit more, it tends to be that the type of assessments that are done, certainly at university level, as we move towards dissertations, and then certainly if you look at the top level, the highest level of examination we have really, which is the doctorate. And what you get in there is very much this kind of blank canvas. So how do we prepare students both academically and for the world of life and the world of work so that they can handle this blank canvas? And I think this is why, for me, it's a superpower, because it says, yeah, let's embrace that blank canvas and let's work out what we can do. And here's a little test for you with your students. If you want to see how they can cope in this situation and find out how many students can actually handle it or not, give them a blank piece of paper. Get them to devise their own projects and stuff like that, and just leave them with that, and leave them with it for 15 minutes. Don't just give it to them and wait and stop, because they'll all capture it in a different way. And it's so interesting to watch the ones who start with a little piece of writing in the middle or at one of the ends. The others will start with this big canvas and start putting stuff all over it. But then ask them to do a summary of it, where they got to after those 15 minutes. And what you'll see will be absolutely fascinating, because suddenly, without the guide of the teacher, what happens and how can they tackle these things? So it's just a quick little litmus test to see where they're at. And I think, this becomes really crucial, because different people have different definitions of what we mean by independent learning. So I just put down here 4 here. Now, the first one is in an early years kindergarten type approach. The definition, or the feeling of what independent learning there is, very much around, can they tie their own shoelaces? Are they toilet trained, and can they go to the toilet by themselves? So it's that notion, and the emphasis is put on the independence rather than the learning element of it. The second one I've pointed out there is this kind of homework and coursework, which was very much part of movements that have come out throughout education of, can the child then pick up and then really work with what they're going with in the way that we'd want them to, and get the most out of it. And it's quite fascinating to see those who can and can't. The third area, or C here, I put down, is this whole notion of self-study. And I think this is one that we've kind of emphasised an awful lot. We tend to throw children into this self-study, and some of them thrive on self-study and they do really well. Other ones, kind of struggle a little bit more. But I'm just going to say that independent study is different from independent learning. And you'll start to see why, because independent learning is a much more sophisticated and a bigger construct. Often with self-study, we preset the work in not dissimilar way in terms of homework and coursework. I mean, they came in as a panacea 20, 25 years ago to test the kind of project skills of kids and really try and develop them as we could. But what happened, what we saw, was a lot of blueprinting going on by schools. So providing the structures and the scaffolds which would ensure the success of the kids, but never really tested and really tried out their own skills of independent learning. And then, as one wag once said to me, is independent learning Friday morning after a late night the night before, when I kind of sit at the front and leave the students to get on with it? Absolutely not. And this is where it becomes quite interesting. So when we look at the researchers, and this is quite interesting point, Carl Rogers in the 1970s concluded that about 30% of students had the independent learning skills that they need, or needed within the curriculum to be able to do all those things and far more besides. Now, when we were doing our tests in the kind of 2000s, what we find is that probably gone down to 20%, and it's quite interesting as we've become more formal in the education, and also in some ways more linear in the way that we're instructing. We're getting better results out of the linearity, but there may be a sacrifice or a trade-off here that we may not be developing in the same ways we might want independent learning. So when we really kind of unpick it, we're looking at this kind of definition. What does it mean then? Not depending on authority or control, and this is where we've seen, certainly through the COVID pandemic, where schools have emphasised on teaching and over teaching in order to get those outcomes that they were looking for from the children. They're the ones that probably suffered the most, because it's as those structures fall away, what are you left with underneath? And it's very much that exploration of that that's part of the independent learning journey. So, it sits on there. You'll notice they're self-governing, not depending on another thing for validity. It says etc. there. So what we're talking about here is knowing where they're at any one time, knowing what I think John Hattie would call is assessment capable. So they have the expectations, but they're also aware and able to quality control themselves as they're going along. They're not waiting for the teacher to make those decisions for them. So it's quite a switch over in terms of that. And there are ways around this, and we'll talk about it in a little more detail, because one of the things certainly that I found was that teachers really struggled with this control and handing over the control aspect. And it wasn't just a bit of control, it was kind of, I think teachers don't realise quite how much control really goes on within a lesson and within a classroom. And certainly when the research was done on primary classrooms in England in this particular case, but it was repeated elsewhere in the world and came up with very similar results. The question came on what percentage of the time are the teachers in control through talking? And what we found after 4,000 studies in lessons, that 89% of the times the teachers were talking. So if you're talking 89% of the time, it doesn't leave an awful lot of time left then for what the students are doing in terms of their learning and that developing of the independent learning facets. And that was the average, remember, 89%. I was interested when it was all played back to them, they kind of looked at it and went, I didn't realise I was doing that. And what they were tending to do was do their input, do their direct instruction or whatever it was, and then they'd leave the students to get on with exercises and things. And while they were doing it, they were observing what students were doing, finding misinterpretations, finding people off in the wrong direction, stopping the class, moving on, telling them, no, you've got to do this. And this is what was making up the time. So it wasn't really spent on the learning, it was spent more on the classroom management at the time, which is quite fascinating anyway. So the management and that control was coming straight forward from the teachers. Then we said not depending on another person for one's opinion, or livelihood, which is, I can see why government should get a little bit behind this one, although the opinion one's a more difficult one, obviously, because people have opinions which obviously are more challenging, and that's part of the role of the teacher to challenge those opinions. And then not supported from public funds. So I can see it being very positive with a lot of governments. But for me, I think when we did that research, I'd also spent a lot of time researching entrepreneurial skills and the development of entrepreneurism in school. And certainly there was a lot akin between independent learning and entrepreneurialism. So maybe we're asking students to become more entrepreneurial in their approach to learning. So the man himself, John Hattie, he's two of the things that he would really push very hard for was that students know what to do when they don't know what to do. So what do we mean by this, slight conundrum? It means that, they should be fine, as they move between novice more towards more expertise in that level of learning, but they should know how to apply things and how to move things around differently. Yet every teacher will know, with frustration sometimes, that what's taught in maths doesn't necessarily transfer to other subjects. So obviously there is an issue going on of how do we move out of the tramlines of the curriculum that we've got and then move on to these kind of more complex needs or applications of our learning, and where do we start? What's that starting point, and how does that starting point move us on as we're working in it? And I think this second one really, really, really crucial when learners become their own teachers. And it's this notion of, one thing is for the teacher to observe the learners and really understand how they're applying their learner processes. And that's not really independent learning. That's when we start to look at impact of learning and see if that happens. But this is the one where the students themselves then start to take the reins and start to be able to move things forward. Why is that so important? Well, that's so important because the motivation follows the learning at this particular point. And that's really, really crucial for us in terms of where we're going, because the effort's now going to be leveraged onto the learner. And in terms of subject expertise, which is one of the research areas which John's been involved in, a lot of other people have been involved in, what we've found is when teachers are teaching in their subjects, it doesn't really make that much odds as to what your subject knowledge is if you're talking through direct instruction or through other means that you might be using where you're teaching. And they did a big study here where they were looking at music and physics teachers, and they reversed them so that physics teachers were teaching music and music teachers were teaching physics. A different combination, obviously, with those two. And as you can imagine, very little difference, unfortunately, for the subject specialist. So if you're following traditional curriculum, it doesn't make much difference. However, and here's the big however, when the subject matter was more complex, the learners were more expert, and they'd mastered the basic constructs, then the subject knowledge really mattered, because now the students were starting to ask complex questions. What that meant was, instead of just having to be 1 page or 2 pages ahead of the students, you did need that huge body of knowledge that you're building up over huge periods of your own study. And so this the learners becoming their own teachers is great, and then you get to follow that with your great wisdom, and really adds an awful lot of value through the subject knowledge that you've developed. So quite an exciting, different way, if you like, of working in this teaching domain. So the next bit I'm going to just move on to here is looking at what do we really mean by independent. Then if we're looking at groups and stuff like that, does independent mean individual? And I think this is where I pointed out this self-study. Independent really doesn't just mean individual. If you're relying on individuals, it really does cast them onto the set of skills that they've got. So they either kind of sink or swim. And if you remember, I've just mentioned the 80-20 rule, where 80% are probably going to sink a little bit or sink a lot. Now, the problem is, where do they go then to get, sort of the help and the assistance that they need? So I think it's always best to think of independence as these three things. Independent, yes, I've got to be able to take individual responsibility, and I should be able to get quite a long distance. But the interdependent element is so crucial as well. So this is where we get more collaborative. It may be peer-to-peer, maybe smaller groups, which we kind of often refer to as collaborative. And then this is where you've got to share ideas and sort of show the social sensitivity, start to realize that different people lead at different times within that group and understand those. And I'll go into those in a bit more detail a little later. And then this third group, which was the hardest group, the cooperative, the skills to work intergroup. So you're not just being interdependent, you're actually working intergroup. So how does a whole year group work together when they're working independently? Does one group go and nick all the resources as fast as they can and hang on to them, as I've seen multiple times happen, because they view it as a competitive activity? And understanding it as a cooperative activity becomes even more crucial when we look at sort of big, wicked problems such as climate change, and how do we solve that? Because if we're going to try and do it by groups or by individual nations and stuff, it's going to be incredibly difficult. We've got to actually cooperate across the world as we eat up the resources so fast. So independent, interdependent and cooperative all working together and moving seamlessly between them, for me, is where we're heading independent learning into. So why IL? Why would I bother doing this? So, I've already mentioned the kind of further study, and we know how difficult a lot of students find this when they get off to university. Often the skill set hasn't been built. Now, the interesting one I've found, I'm in quite a large organisation. We used to have a graduate training scheme where we take on about 10 graduates a year. We'd be interviewing them and then take them through. So one of the big things because I was curious about independent learning, was whether this had been developed at university. And sadly, the answer was no. Whilst they'd done group work, it had been not dissimilar to the sort of group work you do in schools, where you were put into a group of various kinds and given a task, and off you go and get on with it. So why isn't that independent learning? Well, it's not independent learning because no one's actually developed the group skills with you and developed the constructs that you're working in. So what we've got to be aware of is that partly we're working process here and partly we're working outcome. Whereas in the normal curriculum, we're more focused on the outcome, the teacher's in charge of the process. What we're doing with independent learning is actually offering the process over to the students. And that's where this kind of, the 80% really do need a lot of development. I think the second area I'd always go to is, and my wife would totally agree with this, is knowing yourself, because it's one of the hardest things in life to ever really get to know yourself. And what independent learning, because it stretches you as an individual, you as a collaborator, and you as a cooperator, it really stretches your personality and how it's got to blend and understand much more about the world. Much more difficult to put yourself in a box if you're doing independent learning and just say, look, no, this is me, this is what I believe in. You've got to start listening to other people's beliefs. And then I think the third element I'll mention there is motivation. And motivation, we've already said, comes from the learning and the depth of the learning. But I think that it's also that kind of nature of an authenticity as part of the process. So I'm a creator of the learning. And I'm also going to be a critiquer of that learning as it comes about. And I'll get right into, well, why does this and how does that one work? And I think then the last bit within that then becomes this transfer element, which I know John Hattie talks about a lot in his model in terms of surface deep transfer. What does transfer look like? And this is our ability to take knowledge and understanding from one domain and put it into another domain. And so the transfer is much help with that independent learning, because you've got time to grapple with it and find it and really understand, well, how does this move into a different element? Next one is this whole area of agency. We're hearing a lot now about student agency and how do we get more student agency. We know from the Jenkins curve that about the ages of 13, that only 36% of children want to be in school. And when we find out about them, it sits in with this agency and responsibility. They want the responsibility to be able to learn for themselves, but we've got to have a successful way of transferring it to them. And this is what independent learning offers. And this is not to diminish the role of teachers in teaching surface and procedural knowledge. These are absolutely crucial to all learners. But I think often we assume that we can jump from one to the other. And it doesn't quite work that way. There isn't an osmotic relationship there, as I'm going to explain in a moment. And then the last one is this whole working with others, and how do we get on with others and how do we develop that? And we know from all the research, it doesn't need to be ground out again, that we are a human tribal species who get on best and are happiest when we're working with others. So much as other people may say, no, a group work, we don't want it, it's not efficient enough. We do need it for our mental health, if nothing else. But I think it's so much more when we get to that stage. And when we can see when the sum of the parts is greater than the whole, that's when it gets really exciting and people realise and then become much more vested in that. So this is what I was talking about in terms of, if I was to layer this and say, well, what does learning look like at the moment? I mean, we've obviously got this surface layer of surface learning, the knowledge that people need, the facts, if you like, or to be conversant, to be able to understand and own that surface knowledge. It's not arguable. That is what people definitely need. But then below that, we've always had these arguments about deep learning. What is deep learning? What does it look like? About things like metacognition and how we're able to understand how we're learning, but also how we can apply those constructs that we're getting there from the surface. And things like SOLO helped us along in our understanding of that. So we're fairly good understanding between surface and deep. We then move into this area of competencies. Now, competencies have sometimes been referred to as 21st century skills. I don't think that's a particularly helpful term, not least because we're a quarter of the way through the 21st century. But the competencies are much less understood in terms of what they are and how they work. The tendency within schools has been to look at these as though they were surface knowledge and try and teach them explicitly. Now, the problem with competencies is they're highly interdependent with each other. So you can't really define one off without moving into another bit of another one. And that doesn't help really when you're all trying to organise a curriculum. And attempts where we're trying to do this through things like Angela Duckworth's Grit, through Carol Dweck's Growth Mindset, when we observe them and we pull them apart in the lab, we can see that they are a distinctive construct. But when you actually move them into the main arena of education and then try and treat them as a separate construct, suddenly they start to fall apart a little bit. And it's much harder to prove an impact on these without in the same way as it is when you do it through observational data. So this has been kind of slightly problematical in the competencies area. So the problem isn't we can't identify them, we can't see them, we can't watch how they behave. But what we are less sure about is how we develop those and that complexity around that. And then I'll put down this kind of bedrock level, if you like, character, strengths and virtues. Now we know there's been masses of work on this now, not to mention Martin Seligman's work and his team through the positive psychology movement, the character movement in Birmingham, the works that they were doing, Guy Claxton's work at looking at this. So we know that these exist, they're innate in everyone. Different people will ping onto certain ones. For example, creativity is one that's in there. We know they're measurable. But we know far less about their development and how we actually develop these. But these are the kind of sets of the sets of dispositions, almost, if you like, that we have got that sit there. So that's what we're moving between, these kind of four levels. And when you're working in independent learning, the great advantage is you can start on the competencies level and you can define the competencies as you want. So they can become the character of your school, if you like, what you put in your prospectus. They can become what the context requires at that particular point. The character, strengths and virtues are pretty unchangeable, if you like, in many ways. But that's where we're beginning at this competencies level. And then through that, we come out and then we can go through the deep and the surface. And the other interesting thing with independent learning is, the perceived wisdom is you teach the surface so you've got the knowledge, then you go deep because now we can apply it and things like that. Within independent learning, because it kind of throws everything up in the air a little bit and you're starting to work in the competencies level, you're never really sure whether you're at deep level or surface. The competencies drive the deep questions, and the deep questions will drive the surface knowledge. And as long as you've got time, the surface knowledge can then fit around that. Now, what I'm not saying is independent learning is the most efficient way to teach a class through a progression in order to be able to pass an exam at the end. What I'm saying is that in order to develop as a rounded human being, to have those skills that you need for further study and things like that, yes, the qualifications are important, but also we need to develop on this kind of level, all four of these levels, and we should be very capable of doing that in education. So Why doesn't it happen? This was fascinating for me. 8 years of study and doing projects across numerous schools and in numerous settings, and watching the reaction of people when you're trying to explain that there's something going on here which is far more interesting, if you like, from my point of view, but also far more demanding. And I think it's demanding. And this, here's the main reasons. So the first one is that teachers underestimated the skills that were needed to do independent learning. Mike Roberts, who did a lot of research in this, more at undergraduate level, but same students, said the scale, breadth, depth, and complexity of skills demanded for autonomous project management were neither understood nor appreciated by the teachers. And that's quite condemning in some ways. And it sort of says, well, what have we been doing all this time? Why haven't we kind of got our head around this? And it is because it is so complex. There's nothing harder. If you go on a project management course, they will spend, out of the time on that project management course, 3/5 of the time will be spent on defining the project. So it doesn't overrun and it doesn't kind of get under-expand, if you like. It's got enough scope in it. And you've got to work all this out before you even get started. And the thing in education is we tend to be much more doers. So we're a bit more focused on getting kids to do something, get them engaged, make them look busy, should I say. Whereas this is the kind of hard thinking, you get the head scratching, and this is where the blank piece of paper comes back in. Has something come on it? Are they able to define a project and what it looks like? So it's pretty hard to do then, and if we don't understand those, then it's much harder, and if they haven't been developed in the students. The second issue we've got is orientation of the curriculum, and someone once said that, we've got 21st century students being taught by 20th century teachers in a 19th century buildings with an 18th century curriculum, because the curriculum hasn't changed much. It's a demand put in through higher education that works its way through the system. So if that's the way the system's orientated, it almost independent learning is going against that grain, and it's quite difficult, therefore, to find a home or to find efficient ways of actually reaching that. The third element here is the energy required. It's a lot more harder thinking for the students. You're demanding so much more of them because they're operating at all 4 of those levels, from the surface to the deep through to the competencies, and then getting back to those character strengths that they've already got. So if it's harder, the brain naturally doesn't like it. And the same goes in some ways for teachers, because if you've got a successful formula and you can get the best out of students, why would you want to change that formula? The fourth one here I mentioned is the curriculum. We seem to have got quite obsessed by curriculum, which is fine, and we can argue about the curriculum, but there's arguments of less than 20% of the curriculum. 80% is already in there, and we already know what that is, and it doesn't really change much over time. And all the great changes and stuff like that, when you actually analyse the impact of the changes, it seems that changing a curriculum is probably one of the least impactful things that you can do in education, sadly. And it's mainly because of all the adjustment that's needed. So it takes 3 years to adjust to a new curriculum change. By the time you work through, well, what is this new curriculum? How do we assess it? What skills are we looking for in there? How do we embed those skills in our students? And what new knowledge do we need to get embedded in there? And that takes away from the main thing, which is the learning. So it can be a distraction changed into a curriculum. The fifth element, which I found, was it's little known. I wanted to do my PhD in independent learning. So the first thing, obviously, they say is, well, what reading are you going to do? And I'm scratching my head because I'd been all over the place and I couldn't find very much work in it. I'll talk to the one person who did a lot of work in here. And I went interviewing people all over the country, and just no one really understood that much about this area. And then this last area is this whole area of assessment and what we're assessing and the way we're assessing it. I know this is a continual revolving argument, but if you're going to assess kids and put the most emphasis on an end of year or an end of period of time external test, which we know that most of the focus is going to be on surface knowledge, whether we like it or not. That is, the game that's being played. Independent learning is not really going to be tested. It's going to test such a small proportion of what you're actually doing in developing an independent learning that it's not really going to add that much value. So it's very difficult, therefore, then to justify independent learning if it doesn't add value to the test. Okay, I'm not saying it should be, but I'm just saying this is what the reality is that we're facing. So, to take this on further then, and I like this kind of notion of, well, what do we mean? There's been a lot of emphasis in educational autonomy, and that students should have more autonomy, that schools should have autonomy, teachers should have autonomy. And, I just ask the question, what do we really mean by autonomy? And I think this has got a bit lost, because if we're just saying, everyone should have more autonomy over what, to do what, and, who's going to define this, and why should they be defining it? And I think in the end, the government's pay, it's public purse, most of the money that goes into education. So therefore, it's fair enough that the government define what the curriculum is and what the expectations are and things like that. But it's our job as teachers to take it much further. So I prefer this word automaticity. And I think it sort of sums up what we're trying to get to. Now, so automaticity takes learning beyond the novice to the expert, beyond mastery, through over-practicing, through over-learning, into this area of automaticity. And to explain what I mean a little bit more, one of my friends is Barry Heimer, Professor Barry Heimer, cited his daughter and her friend. His daughter and her friend were both fabulous musicians. They were both in the county orchestra. They both did their grade 8s. And so off they went. Anyway, Young Musician of the Year came up. And his daughter didn't get selected, but the other person did get selected. And absolutely fascinating. So Barry had to ask why. What happened? How come? And tell me about your practice, because he knew how important practice was in there. So his daughter says, I practice and practice until I get it right. So he talked to her friends, and she said, I practice and practice until I can't get it wrong. And therein lies the difference of this automaticity. So what we're trying to do is build in people the skills, not to give them autonomy, to give them automaticity, so they're able then to use these skills in other areas, or these competencies, these ways of working, this knowing what to do when I don't know what to do, this becoming the teacher or becoming my own teacher, because that's where it's going to have to be if we go for lifetime learning constructs. Anyway, so I promised some how, and let's get some practicals in here. So here's a quick 10 ways, if you like, that you can do the baby steps, if you like. Now, what I can't guarantee is that these will definitely lead you to where you need to go to in terms of developing independent learning, but at least it's a touch on the right direction. So at least it'll get you, started, and we've got something practical going on. So number one, develop your own standards in IL. What do you mean by IL in your school? Now, what we found, certainly through the visible learning work we've been doing with John's team over the 10 years, is that anything can go on to progressions. So why not develop independent learning onto progression? What does a progression of independent learning look like? What's the definition you want to use of your school? I'll give you some pointers as we go through this, but write a policy on it, have a progression on it, develop those standards, and then we've got something to compare it with and move. And what we found is schools that were able to do that could move an awful lot further along this line if once they got something in place that everyone was happy with, understood, and had carried a degree of specificity. And the second one is this plan time for reflection. Okay, we know how important evaluation is, we know how important reflection is, we know how important judgment is. They've all got to be one part of this whole assessment, or the three parts, constituent parts of the assessment piece. Now, there's really easy ways of doing this, and we found these were particularly useful in independent learning, and it's the ipsative methodology of assessments. Because these constructs aren't so well understood, you can use a kind of, it's a bit like if you go into a hospital, they say, how much is the pain? Give me on a scale of 1 to 10. So an ipsative scale is just a notional scale of 1 to 10 or 1 to 5. So what I'm trying to do is give birth to a comparative in the mind of the person. Now, the best way of doing this is actually print out the cards. You can do it on laptops and stuff, iPads, all those sorts of things, and other brands are perfectly acceptable as well. But what you're trying to do is get the person to touch the card that they think they're on and push it up, and then say, well, where do you want to be on that scale? Push that up. And so then they're starting to make an emotional and physical contact with where they're at. We're not using objective scale here. It's just too complicated. And then you start treating it more like surface knowledge and trying to teach it. By using the ipsative scale, just use a 1 to 5 scale to begin with. It's perfectly adequate and works really well. But what you're doing is nudging constantly the students to be thinking about that. How am I compared with where I was before? Where do I want to get to? Do I still want to pursue this? And I'll talk a little bit more about the sort of criteria you can do that around, but really, really neat way of moving it on. Next one is the questions. Golly gosh. here's an IL teacher after we're doing some of the projects. I didn't realise that I was the first port of call for pupils. I've changed now to become their last port of call. And this is this kind of answering no questions as a teacher. And it's quite difficult to train yourself into because you're often regarded as a fountain of all knowledge. But by deflecting those questions, asking the students what they think, bringing other students in to make that commentary, they won't always get it right, but that's always great feedback for you, and you can work with that and move that on further. So try, that policy of answer no questions. It's quite hard to stick to. What I used to do was I made a little number plate for myself. It's a GB1. If you're watching from UK, you'll be familiar with it, although the EU signals show it's a little bit out of date now. So we've got 3 before me. So what I was doing was saying, look, before you come to me, I want you to go to 3 other students and ask their opinion, and do go to 3, don't go to 1, because you might just be embedding things that are wrong. But it's moving into that 3 before me. Then when you come to me, you're still not sure, I'm going to ask you, the first thing I'm going to ask you, who are the 3 people that you talk to? So then they get trained into that, I've got to talk to other people about that. So that one is a way of avoiding the questions. Next one is this, and I said avoid questions, but not just questions, tasks. And I think there's we were working recently with Shigata Mitra, who was talking about very much that why aren't we using doctorate level assessment, if that's the best one that there is there? Why aren't we using that within education and getting people to kind of really think about what they're doing and presenting it in different ways? But the crucial part about this is, well, we're going to have something meaty then to get ourselves into. And the easiest way to get meaty stuff to get yourself into is not having a right answer to what you're asking, and see how long people stick at it. And it's quite interesting to see this. Now, the obvious area is to put people into wicked problems. I know when I was at school, I was doing A-level physics, and one of the first things that it showed me was this list of all the experiments and what the outcome should be. I just I'm out of here. And within 3 weeks, I'd left the A-level physics course because I didn't want to do something that was predictable. I wanted to do something that was unpredictable. I wanted to feel like I was contributing. My goodness, there are plenty of really, really complex, wicked problems, both within education and within the world, that our students could be working on. So when you're doing independent learning, or when you're moving towards that, make the problem complex and wicked without necessarily any sort of answer. There was a recent study actually done between Japan and America where they set an impossible maths problem, and they just wanted to see how long the students would stick at it. After a week, most of the American students, interestingly, had given up. I'm not saying that was anything detrimental, but they told them after a week that there isn't an answer to this. The Japanese students kept going for another 2 weeks and still didn't get an answer. But it was that pleasure of the learning and trying to pull about and find some kind of new terrain, if you like, and new ways of thinking that took them on so much further. Mistakes. We always talk about mistakes. We always say, yes, this is the point of learning. We know if you make a mistake, it means you've got something to learn, and that's really exciting, or should be really exciting. But yeah, when we look at most classes, we know from the independent learning research, interestingly, that there are various intrinsic motivants, and one of them is competency. And when we looked at the gender split, it was incredible. There was a 95% swing towards girls being driven by competency. What that means is they don't like making mistakes, and they don't like making them in public, certainly. I was once on a plane, actually, with someone who was from Las Vegas. She was running one of the big casinos there. And she explained to me, when women play on the casinos, generally, they don't like to play at tables until they've developed a really high level of competency on those tables. So you'll tend to see them on the slots. And that's why a lot of the slot machines are, because it can be done much more individually. So it's quite a difficult one to overcome if that's a major inherent thing. Boys are a bit more slapdash because they like the competition thing, and I'm being terribly gender specific there, but it is what actually came out of the findings. Virtually no difference in any of the other intrinsic motivants when we looked at within the context of independent learning. So it's getting kids to understand that the mistake is the point of learning. If they're getting it right and they're getting 100%, they're not really learning much. And the other thing is, if they're getting 10 out of 10, 9 out of 10, the teacher's not learning much from them as well. They're just learning that what they can already do. So we need to stretch those much more. Okay, next one is to look at this kind of notion of what an independent learning cycle or what a learning cycle looks like. Very much if you're starting in that kind of top right corner there, where you've got the experience, we usually start with some kind of experience. So what? Comes the question. Okay, well, here's the theory that underpins it. And then we move down through the next bit. Okay, so let's practice that. So we've actually developed that kind of expertise in it. Why is that important then? Then we move on to the application. Where else can it be applied? So therefore, what next? And then we move on to, well, that generates another experience. So very typically, that's the way an independent learning cycle develops itself. Now, what happens within schools is because maybe pressure of curriculum, the amounts that we need to get through, is we've ended up with this kind of what we call an academic pendulum, if you like. So we kind of have so little time left for the experience that we tend to get into the theory very quickly, move on to the practice test. Theory, practice, test. And so it changes it quite notionally and biases it all towards the bottom of that diagram. And very rarely do we have time to explore the application beyond the immediate context of perhaps an examination question or whatever, and let alone to set up the next experience and let the next experience or that what next be decided by the students and where they need to go through. So what we're trying to do is complete that cycle. So having the awareness of that cycle when you're planning modules, when you're planning year, to have a look and see, well, how are we actually allowing that full frame of it? Very, very useful. The eighth one, critical audience. Don't we love critical audiences? So what we do within independent learning is have an external audience. And it's as simple as that. And they only need to be two people or one person. But people that the students are not familiar with, and it makes it that much more difficult because they now have to over-prepare. So, for example, if we were doing something in health education or something in biology there, we get a doctor and a nurse in, and that would be their panel. So suddenly now they're not presenting to their peers, which are too easy because they know how to entertain them, make them laugh, and they'll get high marks and stuff like that. The teachers, they're too familiar. Teachers are too forgiving. You're too nice to people. It's great that you care and passionately, but if you bring in a more dispassionate external audience, it makes quite a big difference because they're critical. Number 9 then, have this notion of 2 levels of research in your mind whenever you're getting kids to do research. Because one of the big things with independent learning is that people tend to send children off to the library or send them onto Google or wherever it is to find out more information. And the information is what they find. And that's kind of what we call level 1 research. It's very kind of surface based. I've got the facts sorted out and then I'll attempt to make some conclusions with those. Okay, so level 2 research, what we call that, is okay, now come up with your own hypothesis. You've seen what's there, turn that into a hypothesis. And once you've got to turn stuff into hypothesis, it makes it that much more difficult. Suddenly the surface then, you start to see differences between the surface, which you wouldn't have seen in the level 1 research. So it's getting that dig into level 2 research and having that, a little diagram of it. If you're going to do project work on your board, okay, what's that? Is that level 1 or level 2 research? So the students develop that language of it. And then the 10th one, I'm going to talk about group dynamics here because I know groups have become, it's so fascinating, isn't it? 20 years ago, we were talking about direct instruction in England. No one knew what we were talking about. Now everyone's talking about direct instruction like it's the Holy Grail. And it's a very efficient method. I'm not going to downcry it at all. But what I am going to talk about is a little bit is groups, because certainly in primary schools, sometimes in secondary schools, a lot of group work's used, or at least, should I say, the tables are put into groups. As I've already explained, 89% of the time, teachers are talking at the students, so therefore they spend the rest of the time going like this. This isn't group work. There's been quite a bit of research into groups, and what we've found is that we're not very good at developing groups in school. I'll make an exception there. If you're in the drama department, drama teacher, they are the one area of the curriculum where they do develop groups and they do expose that group work and the importance of that group work. So you've got a rich resource straight away there. Go to them. How do they do it? Jean Stanford did some of the major work on adolescence and how you develop groups in adolescence. That book was never published, and sadly Jean died. And it was never gone out there, but it was an absolute treasure trove of it. The crucial bit to remember here, though, and there was a lovely thing, why teams don't work. And what they said was, if you take your team away to do a team building exercise, the obvious one is take them to a lake, get them to build a raft. Here's a load of stuff that we can cobble together. It works absolutely fantastically well. And the next time that team has to go away to a lake and build a raft, they'll be able to do it. Unfortunately, it is so little transfer, it's almost not worth doing. So if you're going to develop groups and group dynamics, it has to be done in the concept or in the context of academic work. And if we're saying that independent learning part of it is interdependent learning, then we've got to actually develop it within that context. So that becomes absolutely crucial within there. So remember that one. Develop the groups in the context in the way that you want them to work, so they become familiar with them. Okay, so beyond this then, there's certain methodologies which do lend themselves better towards independent learning. I will say better because they're not designed specifically for independent learning, although they'll use them. PSC, or philosophy for communities, philosophy children, sometimes called, very rich, more dialogistic, but really good at developing cooperative skills and group skills. Dilemma-based learning, problem-based learning, which you'll be familiar with. High-tech high, sometimes called project-based learning. They're okay. They're fine because it's an inquiry-based methodology, and as long as the teachers understand inquiry-based learning, you've got very motivated students and you surround them with the right circumstances, it can work really well. However, it's not the quickest way to transfer the independent learning skills, and it's been proved to be quite inefficient if you just put it into a normal situation where the teachers are less what should I say, validating of such an approach. Montessori, Steiner definitely had elements of these in them and certainly had an understanding of what that progression would like. Suggestiopedia and Vygotsky more so, in terms of that knowledge of the zone of proximal development. But Vygotsky's understanding was much wider than the narrow curriculum confines that we use in that, so it would be applied nicely there. And Reggio Emilia, which sits right at the heart of it, however, hasn't really been developed much more beyond probably Key Stage 1 in England, 7, 8, 9-year-olds. It doesn't really move upwards with the learners because it becomes more problematical to use as a process when you've got quite high levels of content. So what I'm going to say here is leverage whatever you do. I love this word, high leverage, and you'll see why independent learning can work well. You know, if I'm going to actually try and put some independent learning in, how can I do it? Well, if I look at high inputs and outcomes, and thank you to David Hargreaves many years ago provided this for me. High with low outcomes leads to frustration. So you've got to really be careful what you're doing. This is one of the reasons why 21st century skills isn't really getting the full that it may get, because it is. And if someone says, oh, let's change all the assessment system to improve education, it can lead to frustration because it doesn't necessarily produce the outcomes you're looking. The 21st century skills, it's not because of the 21st century skills, it's because it's curriculum change is the issue. And whatever you're going to change your curriculum to can lead to a lot of frustration. Low, all you get is clutter and burden. You don't want that because it just means you're tripping over everything and trying to keep everything moving. We're humans, we're very busy anyway within a school context. We've got to concentrate on the bits that really are going to bring the bang for the buck, if you like. If we've got high inputs producing high outcomes, great, we seem like we're getting somewhere, okay? The problem is exhaustion, burnout, and this is over-teaching, if you like. When we're over-teaching, we're taking responsibility for the learners. You know, if someone says, let's have an extra half an hour to every day in the school, most teachers are going to look and go, where am I going to get the energy for that? It's because they are working so hard that it's very difficult within that. And yes, it should, in theory, produce outcome, but it might actually produce a lot of resignations. The ideal is low inputs with high outcome. Everyone wants it. Independent learning, I feel, in some ways offers it, and this is the project-based version, which I'm going to give you the 5-minute run over so you get a kind of sense of it before we wrap up today. So this was independent learning project. Dr. Reece Griffith was behind it, involved 120 schools, over 8,000 students, 350 teachers, and ran over 15 years. And he went back and interviewed them, and it was absolutely fascinating. These are students who left the school in 25, 30-year-olds. What was your most memorable experience of schools? They didn't know Reece and they didn't know what he'd done with them. Virtually everyone said, it was this project I did, or it was when I did this, which was one of the independent projects they'd done. This was mainly done in the Cornwall region, interestingly. So he was cutting a really, really interesting project through there, and he had the base over that period of time to really be able to understand what the impact was. And certainly when I did 8 years of work within this methodology, we were finding very, very similar outcomes. So the crucial bit was he set up a number of factors which he defined as independent learning in the end, and it was done through trial and error. It wasn't let's create a master list and let's hope they are. So the first one was these social factors. You just work between these three: the individual responsibility, cooperative groups, which is the intergroup work, and the collaborative groups, which was a group of 3 to 5 people. And so what we were giving them was essentially 25 to 35 hours to work on one particular whatever they wanted to be. We give them a rough theme and say, work within that theme, but it's up to you which way you go. You define the project as you wish, but you're going to be working in this collaborative group. Just a word to the wise on that: don't try and structure the groups yourself. The kids will see through it straight away. They like fair, so if it's named out of a hat or whatever, do it that way. It's much quicker. So that was the first 3 criteria. The second lot of criteria which we used within this independent learning concept was critical disposition. And who doesn't want kids to have a critical disposition? But what do we mean by that? And here's the crucial bit. This is not critical thinking. Notice this is a critical disposition of everything you do. So we've got student design tasks, their responsibility to design the task. We might give them the rough theme or the inspiration to get on into and dive into somewhere, but they had to design the task. Student design research, so they knew what level 1 and level 2 research were. We were going to actually test them on that and make sure they did it. Student negotiated deadlines, so when they all agreed to do something, would they carry it out or not? Would all of them carry it out or not? And how were they going to deal with the frustration when they didn't, or when some people said they were going to do something and then didn't, or didn't do it to the standard that was expected by the rest of the group? And in student designed assessment, how would they know if they were being successful? And this last one, which is the absolute golden gem for me of the whole of the independent learning, reflexivity. Yeah, and this is not just to reflect on what you've done, but to actually iterate what you've done. So you have this continual loop where you're reflecting, acting, reflecting, plan, doing, acting, and moving it forwards. So the progression should work really well and through it. But developing that skill in students, it's the skill behind redrafting, it's the skill behind Austin's butterfly, and that's what reflexivity sits in there. But when the students are doing it by themselves automatically, rather than me having to go and tell them to go and do it. And then lastly, there were some outcomes factors around presentation, sense of audience. I've mentioned a bit about that, how it affects the community environment and how you draw from the community environment and how you give back to that community environment, and don't limit the ICT, let them set the limitations on the ICT and how they can use it. So practical outcomes, we just got them to make a short video, which is fine. They had to do a publication of some kind or another, short live presentation, a bibliography showing all the research bits that they'd done, so they had to keep all those, and then a project diary. And what I did when I was doing the later one was to actually get them to reflect, and we picked 5 out of those 12 criteria that I've just been through. We'd pick 3, 4 or 5 of those depending on which the group was, and then we would just get them to reflect on that. So they're reflecting on things like sense of audience and preparing for that, like their student design task and how well it was designed, their individual responsibility. And we were using ipsative methods there for them to be able to kind of reflect on that, and we'd facilitate the reflection on it. What we didn't do, though, was get involved with the content and the outcomes. That was up for them. The practical outcomes here. That was up for them to decide how they did it, and we were trying to not get overly interested in it. We were fascinated, but we try and just withdraw that interest from it, just so we were only interested in those factors we're developing. So therefore, then they were ensured that it wasn't surface knowledge or the skills at this point. We're not saying they're not important yet, but it was getting into those competencies that we were trying to drive and develop, so they became independent learners and became aware of it. So from that, then, I'm just going to conclude with a few bits. So that project, as I say, ran for about 8 years, was incredibly successful. We ran it with mixed age groups at times. We ran it with whole year groups. We ran it 1 hour a week. One of the questions is, when do you do this? I would always argue do it the first week of term when the kids are fresh. Perhaps they're into new groups, new school, new year groups. You've got brilliant time to do it then, because what you're actually doing is you're orientating them for learning around group and inclusive activities. So you get them a well-bonded group before you start the teaching. And so it actually accelerates all the other, should we say, more exam-orientated teaching methodologies. So it works really nicely. And they feel like they've had their voice and authenticity. So I will mention some stiflers here because they're always good to watch for. If you're going to set your course and say, yeah, I like this independent learning, we're heading this way, watch out for the following. First one, over-teaching. Yeah, if we're heading towards over-teaching, we're probably drawing away from over-learning. Now, it's become very vogue, this over-teaching, to get that surface knowledge in. That's fine, yeah, but if you're heading towards independent learning, you can't really work the two together. They do become slightly difficult, but you can set your projects in at different times in the year group so it works. The second one is apathy. Csikszentmihalyi, Haile Csikszentmihalyi, one of my favourite psychologists, and one of my favourite names of psychologists as well. You'll know his study on flow and the work on flow. He did a massive study on students to find out what state they were in. So he pinged them every, I think, something like 30 times a week to see where they were at, whether they were in lessons and what was going on. Sadly, he found at the greatest extent they were either in apathy or boredom. Which explains the Jenkins curve on the 36%. So whilst we know that some of the methods that we're using are very effective in terms of developing surface knowledge, once you're into a state of apathy or boredom, they're nowhere near as effective. So definitely a stifle of independent learning. Groups without group work, we mentioned there, don't just group kids and then teach them as you normally would. You're going to do proper group work, develop the groups. The fourth one I've got there is short circuit learning. What I mean by this, and this is one of the dangerous things, and I know I'm in a controversial area, is teaching assistants. And sadly, the effect size of teaching assistants is somewhere between 0 and 0.1, no matter what we've tried to do and how we've tried to work. It would seem fairly obvious why, that you've got the most complex learning needs being dealt with by the people who have perhaps the least developed pedagogies. So it's not a great meeting point. But what we've seen when we've observed it is they tend to, and there is this kind of tendency within education to think it's about getting answers right to pass tests. And so therefore, by pushing people towards the answers too quickly, we end up short-circuiting the learning process. So it doesn't then build onto their schemata. And therefore, if it's not in their schemata, there's little chance of the learning being able to be recalled 12 weeks later. So watch out for that one. And then this last one is this focus on performance. And this is kind of, if we're going to do a half-termly data drop, we're looking at exam results. Well, half terms don't even last 12 weeks. We don't even know whether that learning's being secured. So we're producing data for performance reasons and to try and understand performance. And therefore, then we end up with this kind of performative process where everyone gets patted on the back because they're getting the students at the right level rather than because we've actually developed that kind of deep element of learning. Lastly, I will end with this bit here, which was I like to get a little bit philosophical and research based every now and again, and we're familiar with survival of the fittest. And this whole notion that it was the fittest that survived. And, it was a great book and it was a great way of thinking. It's informed so much of science in terms of the way that we work. What people don't realise so much is that the follow-up book was called The Descent of Man. And what this was doing was looking, because obviously after this research being put out there, everything then gets thrown at it. Why do the peacocks have these huge tails which are completely inefficient? And so suddenly you start to look into the species in that way, you realise that sex is also important. Then in actual fact, people choose their partner on whether they're going to be able to not just provide for them, but whether, they're appealing and whether that's, what you want to produce, because that's the way we are coded. So suddenly you realise that fit and sexy have to work together. So what I'm going to argue here very briefly is that, get people fit, really important. What does fit mean? Get the surface in there, get the deep in there, get the learning going, the teaching really, really competent and everything like that. Yeah, but also then think, well, where's the sexy bit? Because if we haven't got the sexy bit, we're not including everyone. We're not getting those kind of wider bits. And here we are, the individualisation, the imperfections of man. The what is imperfect about us becomes the actual perfect about us, and that's what we're trying to develop. The mood swings, what's the high end look like, the bits that are off the scale. We see so many systems now where you've got this at age 11, we've got this kind of cut-off point and schools feel like they're judged against it. What happens to the year 5s, year 6s, the 10, 11-year-olds when they hit those, they've already hit the cut-off point of that particular examination? What can they do at the high end there and really push themselves to that high end? Make it more demand-side, make it more emotional, and independent learning gets very emotional. You'll get tears, you'll get everything when you try it out, and make it attractive, because that's what we want to do. Okay, that was me. That was Stephen Cox. I'm available here, Stephen at Osiris Educational. To say I've now been working in that field for about 20 years. I'm completely fascinated with it. If you're enthusiastic about it, please come and join me. Get in touch and we'll, share that journey. It's not the only journey, but it's a journey that I think is very, very precious. Thank you for joining me today. I really appreciate it. Have a really great rest of your day and whatever else you're up to.
Hi, everyone. I hope you've enjoyed the webinar today. Independent learning has never been so relevant as it is right now. And we've been working with schools across the world for the past 25 years to help them to develop long-term sustainable strategies to help their learners to become more independent. We're offering the opportunity for everyone attending the webinar today to have a free consultation with myself, where I can talk through where your school is at the moment, where you want to be, and then I can design a plan to help you to move forward in whatever direction you'd like to go. So to book a free consultation, just click on the calendar link in the chat section of the webinar, and I'll now pause for 30 seconds whilst you book your appointments. Thanks everyone, have a great evening.